Hello friends, David Vos here. It's a beautiful day in Oklahoma. Hope you're having a beautiful day. Want to get back into this series. Today we're going to kind of put the finishing touch on this series. I think this is going to be very eye-opening. It should be the best one in the series because we're really going to get to some points and some conclusions that not only just pull this all together, but sort of in a revelation. I think it will just sort of, for those of you who've been watching the whole series, it will just pull it all together and give you this revelation of what's going on here. Because we've got a lot of things that we've been talking about, how Israel's not just that one little spot, how it's a larger context. The Bible's talking about something bigger, that Jesus was a king, that he married a queen. They were very wealthy. We were talking about how Jesus' mother was Cleopatra the 7th. All of this is amazing, but we need to pull all this together and show how this fits with history as it comes down to us today. We talked about how it goes through Europe and the Fisher Kings and all the legends and Percival and Sir Lancelot and the unicorns and all of these things. Well, one of the things we haven't gotten into yet that I said, and I promised at the beginning that I was going to tell you about, who is Joseph of Arimathea. Oh, this is going to really help to put things together, friends. Well, first of all, Joseph of Arimathea is actually somebody that we can find in the Bible, so we can start there. And of course, scripturally in the Bible, it just plain says that Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin. Now, it doesn't say Sanhedrin, it says, I think it's Boluthia, but it means, you know, you always look things up and they're like, well, we don't know what it means, but we think it means, or, you know. But it more or less means something. You could translate it a senator. But the problem with it, so we don't know if it's the Sanhedrin or the Senate at Rome. Joseph of Arimathea could have been a great senator, right? For all we know. But we can figure out where he was a counselor or a member of this council. Because, you see, the Senate in Rome had 300 to 600 members. But this Senate only had 72. Now, this is interesting. You probably remember that the Septuagint Bible, the Old Testament Bible, called the Septuagint, it was called that because it means the 72. And it was actually commissioned. They wrote it 250 BC. A bunch of scholars got together. 72 scholars got together. Now, why would 72 scholars get together? Because, you see, Ptolemy II is the man who was very interested, because as we're going to find, these Ptolemies come down to Cleopatra, and Cleopatra gives birth to Jesus. And remember, the Israelites are in Egypt. Oh, buddy, this is going to start putting things together. So, Ptolemy, they built the big library down there. One of the 7 wonders of the world. They wanted people to learn. It was free. We found out the other day, I was telling you in one of the videos, that Jesus became the high priest of Jerusalem. And one of the things that the Talmud and the historical records tell us is that he actually started free schooling, free education above everybody that's above 5 years old. He did that in the same tradition as his great-grandfather, you know, Cleopatra's grandfather, and the Ptolemies, who were interested in free education. Alexandria of Egypt was a great library. A museum. We get the word museum from the Muses. And there were 9 muses of the arts and sciences. And so, they financed that great library. They had dorms there. Anybody could go there and learn for free. And so they were interested in getting, because the Jews were in all the world, they no longer spoke the original Egyptian, as we proved they did speak. And they were now coming out of Babylonian captivity. And they spoke some kind of Aramaic. And so the most of the Jews in the diaspora, because it had been taken over by the Grecian Empire, they all spoke Greek. And down there in Alexandria, remember, the Ptolemies spoke Greek. So they wanted to translate the Bible into Greek so that the Christians of Jesus' time, all the diaspora, they wanted to read the Bible in their own language. They couldn't understand Hebrew or Aramaic. They could only understand Greek, so they wrote it in their common language for them. And of course, Ptolemy, being a pharaoh, was in the long line of the Jewish pharaohs back to Amenhotep, which is Joseph. So he got together 72. Why? He made a Sanhedrin. This is something that all of the Jews had always done. Moses had on Mount Sinai, came down to the bottom of the mountain, and he had 72 elders. And so the 72 elders goes back to Moses. Jesus also chose 12 and 72 also. This is something that you're probably going to hear first. Jesus, as did his great-grandfather Ptolemy II, convened a Sanhedrin. The only person that can do that is a king. You see, Jesus couldn't just go along and say, hey, I'm going to choose 12 people over here. All right, you come on over here and you go over there. And by the way, I'm going to make a 72-member council. For what? Oh, sure, he had a crowd of 5,000 listening to him out in the field, right? They're out in the fields, and he's just got a little turban. He's some little Bedouin with his camel. He's out preaching in nowhere, right? No, Galilee was the entire circuit of the entire region of the diaspora. He went to the Gadarenes. He went to the tribe of Gad. He went to all the lost tribes. They had ships. These weren't boats. These were ships. And Jesus was king, and he convened a grand Sanhedrin. And just like his great-grandfather before him, Ptolemy II, who convened a grand Sanhedrin, built the Library of Alexandria. Pliny and Plutarch and all these people were Jews down there studying in the great libraries. And they translated the Holy Scriptures into the common language that they spoke. That's one of the things that they had done that's the reason for these Sanhedrins, to judge about certain matters, to make decisions for a kingdom, for their government. Jesus was a king. He chose these individuals. Now, we know of the names of the apostles, but very few people know the names of the Sanhedrin that Jesus chose. And very few people realize that when the Sanhedrin condemned him to death, Joseph of Arimathea abstained and refused to vote in favor of killing Jesus. And therefore, there was a majority of people on the Sanhedrin. Another person that didn't want and didn't vote in favor was Nicodemus. Nicodemus is the father of Lazarus. And guess what? Lazarus is the brother of Mary and Martha, the daughter of Cleopatra. So Lazarus is her brother. Lazarus is one of the children of Cleopatra. That's Jesus' brother. And remember, John the Baptist was also related to Jesus, and we're going to get into that. And Joseph of Arimathea was the same as Joseph, who married Mary. Remember, Joseph was his uncle. Joseph of Arimathea was his uncle. The Talmud verifies that. The Talmud says that. I mean, all these people saying Jesus didn't live. There's no historical records. Well, what? What about all these records that we keep finding? Vast books and references to Jesus and his family and Mary. Well, Joseph of Arimathea was Jesus' uncle because Jesus' mother, Cleopatra, and it mentions her name, Cleopas, in the New Testament. That's short for Cleopatra. But she married Ptolemy the 14th. Now he's only 12 years old. It was a marriage of convenience to hold power. They couldn't just marry anybody. Remember, Abraham married his sister. So they didn't have sex or anything. He was only 12 years old. But Cleopatra married her brother, and they were co-regents in that land. Now, if you read secular history, it'll say, oh, well, yeah, Mary died, a snake bit her, she died, committed suicide, and Ptolemy the 14th, her brother that she ruled co-regent over Egypt, he also died. And it's like everybody died. Caesarion, Little Caesar, who, that's just the title, she named him Isu, son of Isis. She was the reincarnation of, she declared herself the reincarnation of Isis and came down in a great triumphant procession with all the regalia, declaring herself to be queen. But you see, these queens could never reign and have power without their husbands. And the husbands could never have power without their wives. So in order to remain queen, she had to be married. So she married her brother to keep the royal seed in that particular line. So Ptolemy the 14th was Joseph of Arimathea. Cleopatra the 7th, which is Mary in the Bible, it says so in our Bibles. It calls her Cleopas. Her brother was Ptolemy the 14th. So you look in history and it says, oh, he died. But then if you look in the fine print, it says we don't know. We don't have a record of what happened to him. So they just assume he died. We don't know what happened to Isu. Well, Plutarch, the historian, says that, and he records all of this, he says that Isu was sent by his mother, Cleopatra, to India. And when he returned, Isu married his own sister, Selina, again to retain the royal blood in the family. They had an arranged marriage. Mary Magdalena means Selina of the Triple Tower, or the Magdala. That was that temple of Serapis that was there in Alexandria, built by the Ptolemies. If Selina, there's no question, it had to, it's not like we're making this up. The temple of Serapis was in Egypt. Who ruled there? Cleopatra's and Ptolemies. They're the ones who built it. They're the royal pharaonic blood. Someone to be called the son of God means they're in the line of the pharaohs, the house of God. And it was Ptolemy the 14th that was the brother of Cleopatra that married her and became the protector of Caesarea. You see, Joseph of Arimathea was a very rich man, a very powerful man. Now, we hear stuff like that and we think, oh, well, you know, he had a little money or whatever. No, he had ships that went all over the world. Nobody has ships. Now, today, a fairly rich man could have ships that go all over the world. But in those days, in order to have a line of ships, he had 10 mines, according to the medieval writings. They called him Joseph of Marmar, because he had all these 10 mines all over the world. And he also mined marble. And so his name, Marmar, Joseph of Marmar, meant, that's Latin for marble. And he mined tin and other metals up in Europe, up in Glastonbury, England. And he went there and he took Jesus there one time. But he also had some mines in Libya of northern Africa, and they called that AMARICA. That is where we get the word America. Marmarica comes from the Latin marmar, and America is just adding an A to Marica. And you see, the ships that discovered America wasn't Columbus. It was a man centuries before that, Joseph of Arimathea, with his line of ships. He went all around the world mining. You see those big mines down there in Peru. There were mines up in North America. And when he come over here, he had all his mapped. So when Joseph of Arimathea took his little cousin, Jesus, his sister's son, who was the one that was destined to become, that was crowned the Son of God, who was the rightful heir to the throne. They weren't fighting over the throne. There's a lot of discussion. If you look into history, you'll see where they'll say, oh, Cleopatra was fighting with her brother. They had a war. They didn't have a war. That's all speculation. They have no, you see, the enemies of Jesus that were trying to kill him because he was the heir apparent was Augustus Caesar. Octavian. His name was originally Octavian, and he named himself Augustus because Julius became a month in the calendar, July. So he decided to name himself Augustus for August. But his name was Octavius, and Octavian, and he had a wife that was jealous. You've probably heard of Mark Antoinette or Marcus Antonio. That was also someone who was related to Caesar. And so when Caesar was crucified and put to death, Mark Antonio ruled the eastern part of Rome, was basically the major ruler of Rome. And he wanted to unite the kingdom, so he was going to marry Octavia, Augustus' daughter, to weld those two lines so that Rome would be represented by one line of kings. Well, Cleopatra was a beautiful woman, and Mark Antonio fell in love with her. So he sort of snubbed Octavia and went off with Cleopatra. This made Octavia very, very, very angry. And the story goes, history says that this Octavia had a relationship, a very close relationship, with Herod's wife. And there was some jealousy because she was angry at Cleopatra. So she wanted to kill Jesus. She wanted to kill John the Baptist because she was jealous. Remember, John the Baptist was also related, a cousin. John the Baptist was saying that Herod shouldn't be married to his brother's sister. His brother was Philip, Philopator of the Ptolemies. And so this gets really complicated. It's kind of hard to follow. But Octavian, being snubbed by Mark Antonio, who went off and married Cleopatra, to get back at him, she went and told Herod, through Herod's wife, because they were good friends, to have John the Baptist's head cut off. That would make Cleopatra angry. You see how that works? The Bible says that Mary's relative gave birth, Elizabeth gave birth to John the Baptist. It doesn't say it's her cousin or her uncle, just as a relative. So we don't know who Elizabeth really was, but they were related. Well, if you read on the internet, do any research, you'll find there's quite a few little theories. There's a lot of people going around nowadays talking about Joseph of Arimathea being the Apostle Paul. It seems that regardless of whether you're a Christian or some sort of secular researcher or whoever you are, there are so many different people researching all this. And it seems like all of them don't like the Apostle Paul. Nobody likes the Apostle Paul. And they don't seem to like Josephus either. They call him a turncoat, a traitor, because he has because he had the Flavian on his title. And they don't like Paul because he was a Roman citizen. It seems like no matter who, I mean, even secular historians seem to be more inclined to think or believe that early Christianity couldn't have been Christian. It had to have been Jewish. See, it had to have been Jewish. Jesus had to have been more Jewish than what the scriptures are letting us, find out. I mean, can't trust the scriptures. Well, let's go over here and look at the Talmud. And the Talmud hate Jesus. They call him a pagan. What? So we can't trust the Bible because the Bible says Jesus is a pagan. So we can trust the Talmud, but the Talmud says that Jesus is a pagan. But we're skeptical of any source because they all say Jesus was a pagan or not a Jew or not following the Jewish Sanhedrin of the law as they had it, not following the Jewish beliefs or the Talmud and the law of Moses. But yet we still think that Jesus was there, but he had to have been a zealot. And Paul obviously didn't believe in the law. And since we can find an argument somewhere in the Bible about that Peter and Paul had, well, there's not an argument. There's simply a disagreement. And the Bible itself patches that up and explains the whole thing. If you just read it, Paul says our beloved brother Peter says that concerning Paul, says he's a beloved brother, that some of the things that he says are hard to be understood by the unsteady and the untaught. But he's our beloved brother, and he teaches things that are truth. He gave him and James and John, gave Paul the right hand of fellowship, sent him out. I mean, look, there's just, as we've gone over and over and over again, we don't want to go back and rehash this, but it puzzles me that anyone who starts researching, in order to find the truth, they throw out the testimony and say, we know better. 2,000 years later, we know better. Well, no. The Talmud is correct. Jesus was a pagan. He wasn't a believer in the law of Moses. Jesus was a Ptolemy of the line of the pharaohs, as we have proven in the other videos. I'm going to try and resist trying to go back and proving each of these little points all over again. You've got to go back and watch the other videos. Up to this point, we have proven that Jesus' mother was Cleopatra VII. And while that may sound extraordinary and, well, Dave, that's crazy, or, you're just making up a whole new theory. What are you talking about? It's like it doesn't make no sense. Well, remember what we said. Jerusalem's in Egypt. They've never found a Temple of Solomon up there in Palestine. And that was the hub of the wheel of astrology and the 12 tribes like spokes in a wheel. They conquered the land outward. When Abraham went down into the land, God gave him all the land from the Nile unto the Euphrates. And if you look at that area, it covers a lot more than what you would think. It goes all the way down to southern Africa. And we're talking about both sides of the Nile. Because the same people that lived on the left side lived on the right side. They got the same temples. And we're talking about everybody on the north, on the both sides of the Euphrates, all the way up into Turkey and all the way around up into Europe. And we've already found the Gadarenes right there in the Galilee, or the wheel of the astrology that Jesus went preaching on. We found the Gadarenes, which is the tribe of Gad. And we've done a little bit of research and found out that over there in Spain, where they went, following, you will receive the sign of Jonah, and then he gets in a boat, and just like Jonah, he ends up in Tarshish, which is Spain. And if you go to Spain today, they've got pilgrimages to this place where Jesus put his foot, and they call themselves the Gadarites, see, or the Gadarenes, the tribe of Gad. They say that they are descendants of the family around Jesus. They say that. They don't know why or how, but this testimony remains with them. And there's a church there that teaches this. And so we talked about how Bethsaida and Bethany and all these locations, we got one town that means a fishery. Jesus around the wheel goes along and is going around the wheel to preach. And he preaches to a town, Bethsaida, which is a fishery, which is Pisces. He goes to all the houses along, but only to the 10 lost tribes is he sent. And this is why it says in the New Testament, he preaches to the Decapolis. Polis in Greek means cities. So Deca means 10. So the 10 cities. There are 10 cities, he says, in a circuit. So what we're finding out then, up to this point that we have shown, is that if Jesus is history Caesarean, that was the son of Cleopatra the seventh. She named him Esau, son of Isis. And his title was Little Caesar because he was supposed to be the son of Caesar. And this means then that John the Baptist, being related to Jesus, must also be a Ptolemy. What we're going to find is that John the Baptist was Ptolemy the 13th. That was a brother of Cleopatra. So, John the Baptist then says to Jesus, I'm going to go on decreasing, and you're going to go on increasing. So what's the deal? What is he talking about? Well, on the astrological wheel, remember, Jesus rises at the horizon. He's going to go up like the sun and rise on the horizon. Jesus is the great king. So we're talking about a new age that's arriving at this very time. And with that star that rose in the east that all the nations recorded, the brightest star that began the new calendar, a new age began. The age of the present age, the age that we've been living through. The age that was past then was the old kingdom. So John was for Ptolemy the 13th. And he represented the pharaohs up until that time. But the power of those pharaonic priests was going to be transferred to Christ, who was going to be a Caesar. Remember we talked about when Elimelech had no more children, and they had to do a levirate marriage. El and Molech is the line of Melchizedek, or the line of the children of Molech, down there with the Canaanites. A royal bloodline, back through Noah, back to Adam. But in the days of Elimelech and Naomi, they didn't have any more children. So they did a Levirate marriage, and they incorporated and joined the two lines. They joined the line of Joseph, who married Asenath, the daughter of Shechem, the Canaanite, of the line of Molech. Joseph's line through Elimelech was married into the line of David, or say Judah, or Boaz and Ruth. So Judah then was put into that line. From that point forward, that area down there called Bethlehem, which remember is that the house of bread. Bethlehem means the house of bread. So that's Virgo. That's where Jesus was born, in the house of bread, on the Galilee, on the wheel. And so in the house of bread, that's where, at the end of Virgo, that's where the sun goes down. And the virgin gives birth, and he goes down into Egypt, down at the bottom of the wheel. So when John says, I'm going to want decreasing, he was saying the pharaonic line that's been going down through the Ptolemies is going to now change, and it's going to go into Caesar. And the royal bloodline of Jesus, King Joseph of Arimathea, is going to go and protect you. He's going to be the knight that protects the Holy Grail. And they're going to take Jesus and Mary Magdalene and form a new holy line of kings, the Fisher kings. And they went up into Europe, and we have the present day royal bloodlines. And he ruled with Cleopatra for a short while, but then he ended up, they divided the kingdom there up between Cleopatra and her brother and another sister, Arsenio. Well, you see, secular history gets a little cloudy, and lots of people want to take secular history over the Bible, but the Bible is what we can trust out of all this, because the fights and the feuds that were going on at that time didn't allow for Augustus Caesar to allow any of this history to get through unless it fit his scenario. So Augustus, who was originally called Octavian, he had a daughter, Octavius. And when Caesar died, then Mark Antonio became the ruler of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And they wanted to make a deal. Augustus Caesar, or Octavian, wanted to make a deal with Mark Antonio. So he said, you come up here and marry my sister, Octavius. Well, Mark Antonio fell in love with Cleopatra, and so he married her instead. This made Octavius very, very angry. And so, according to secular history, she had a relationship, a very close friend, who was the wife of King Herod. This is in history. And so she got to Herod through her friend. You see, in the story we have, John the Baptist was telling them, Herod, that he didn't have the right to be married to that woman because she was his brother's wife. So I guess his brother died and he married his brother's wife, and he thought that was wrong. Herod didn't like that too much, but his wife didn't like it at all. She wanted to be married to Herod because she wanted to be powerful. It was an arranged relationship, as they always do. But you see, we don't get the full intent of what's going on here. John the Baptist wasn't saying that somehow there was incest or anything like that. That wasn't his problem. His problem was he didn't want the kingdom united in that manner. Because Herod was united, the kingdom of Israel, with a Ptolemy. And John the Baptist was Ptolemy the 13th, and he needed the power to remain in the hands of the one that they had agreed upon. The Son of God, he was proclaimed the Son of God, Esau because he was the firstborn son of the rightful heir, Cleopatra VII. So Ptolemy the 14th was fine with it. None of them wanted power. Jesus didn't want power. He wasn't trying to rule the world. They tried to make him king and he refused. He says, my kingdom's no part of this world. So they were all very humble. His brother James understood that his brother was older than him. They were both powerful people. The scripture says that heaven and earth came into being for James. James was almost equally as amazing. These individuals were great philosophers and powerful people. And they were very humble and they were good people. James didn't care if he ruled. It's all, why does my brother get to rule? I want to rule. Right? No, it wasn't like that. And Ptolemy the 14th wasn't saying, I want to rule. We can't give it to this little boy over here. No, they all knew that the important thing was the kingdom of God. And the house of God, the Pharaoh means the house of God. And the son of God means the son of Isis. And so Cleopatra came down in a triumphal procession with all the regalia, declaring herself to be the reincarnation of Isis, and her son Esau to be the son of Isis, the son of God, a royal birth. And so, who is Joseph of Arimathea? He is the uncle of Jesus. The Bible tells us that. Everybody's always believed that. The Talmud states it as a fact. Oh, but the Talmud doesn't believe in Jesus. There's no record of Jesus. The Talmud mentions Jesus over and over and over again. And his brother James, and his uncles, and his family, and Mary Magdalene, and Martha. It mentions them both. And Nicodemus, their father, and Lazarus, their brother. And all of these individuals. So Joseph of Arimathea is Jesus' uncle. Who would that be? The brother of Cleopatra, his mother. And that would be Ptolemy the 14th, the youngest. Now it says very clearly in the Talmud and in other places that Joseph of Arimathea was the youngest of the children of Mary's brother. Okay. So the youngest of the children then would be Ptolemy the 14th. Because remember, there were only 15 of them. And that the 15th was Jesus. So Cleopatra's father's youngest son was Ptolemy the 14th. Ptolemy the 14th had great ships. And he had tin mines. And historical records say that he was mining tin and other metals as well as marble. And so he got the name Joseph of Marmar. This is according to many legends in Europe. So Cleopatra's father's youngest son, Ptolemy the 14th, was a pharaoh as well. He actually ruled Egypt for a short period of time, but he had no intentions of taking the kingdom for himself. They did these sister-brother marriages to keep the lineage in the proper hands, not to defile that lineage that came down from the gods, because remember, he's the son of God. So there wasn't any rivalry between the brothers and sisters at all. Like you see in history, they distort that. They say that Caesar died and Ptolemy the 14th died. But then they admit there's no record. They don't know what happened to them. Plutarch says that Esau, or Caesarion, didn't die, but he was sent to India. And we know that Cleopatra, her son, going to be the son of God, the heir apparent to the world, not of this kingdom. They didn't want to bring in the kingdom of God at that time, but they had to make sure that the line of kings was preserved. And it had to be of that holy lineage. So Ptolemy the 14th wasn't at all concerned about his own power or his own kingdom, because he knew that he wasn't the firstborn. So they had no problem, just like today when you have kings, there may be some rivalry, but Prince Charles is not angry that his mother is the queen, and he's his son. He's her son. She may outlive him and he may never become king. But it's something that they do in these royal bloodlines. Now, there were evil individuals in these bloodlines at times, and they may have killed their rivals and stuff like that. But Cleopatra and Ptolemy the 14th didn't do that. What happened was he became Jesus' protector, because remember, when Jesus was born, Ptolemy the 14th was about 12 years old, or maybe about 10 years old. So Joseph of Arimathea was just a little older than Jesus, and when Jesus became 30, then Joseph of Arimathea was like around 40. And this is when he took remember, because he had this Ptolemaic line back to the pharaohs, they were the wealthiest people in the world. They had ships. They sailed on the Sea of Galilee. That was the entire circumference of the diaspora, which is throughout Europe and all around the world. And so he took his ships up into Glastonbury, England, and there's records of him going there. And they call him the Joseph of Marmar, because Marmar is Latin for marble, because he wasn't just mining tin, he was mining marble. And he also, there's an area in Libya which was originally called Marica. Marica. And if you put an A on the front of that, you've got America. But it comes from Mar, or the tin mines, or the marble mines of Joseph of Arimathea. Arimathea, that word comes from a place in the Old Testament where Samuel lived. They called it Ramah for short. And it was also Ramathaim. And the Septuagint Bible actually tells us that that is where Joseph of Arimathea was from. So that is who Joseph of Arimathea was. That is why he had all these ships. That is why he was going around the world, and even unto America, and discovered America. We don't know where this word America came from. If you ask an historian, they say, well, we don't know. Columbus came over here to discover America, but we don't know why he named it America. Well, he didn't name it America. See, the ships that came over here originally, long centuries before that, it wasn't some Bedouin in his sheep dog and a couple of camels that, got on a little canoe and went to America. The only people that had ships like that were the most powerful people in the world. And Joseph of Arimathea, it says in the Bible, was the richest person. So think about this. We're reading our Bibles, and we're believing that Jesus is the Son of God, while we know that little Caesar was declared the Son of God in history. And we know that at the birth of this Caesarean, Esau, son of Isis, there was a great star that was seen in the sky in the east. They recorded it in China and many nations on the earth, and it was recorded. And to this day, you can look it up. It's the brightest star ever recorded. And That star marked the beginning of the Julian calendar. We know that Caesar was crucified at Golgotha, or Capitol Hill. The Capitol means cap, the head. And the reason they called it that is because when they dug it up to build the Roman Capitol, they found a skull. And that's the only story you're ever going to find. There's no story of a, there are some stories that happened where they're not stories, they're just explanations that people have had over the centuries. They say, well, maybe there's a place in Jerusalem that has a skull under it or something. Maybe there's a rock that looks like a skull, or maybe there's a mountain that looks like a skull, or maybe, they've just speculated. But there's no historical records that says that there's any place called Golgotha in Israel. Golgotha is just a particular way of saying in a particular language the same thing as in Greek cranium, or in Latin capital. It means the skull. And they named it that because they found a human skull there. And so we're looking at all this information and we're saying, okay, this is starting to make sense. Starting to make a little sense. Jesus was preaching in Galilee. That's a wheel. And he goes through Decapolis, or the 10 cities, or the 10 lost tribes. And he goes to Bethsaida, or the fishery, or Pisces. And he goes to the Gadarenes, or the house of Gad, because there's 12 houses. Jesus was born in the house of Bethlehem. Bethlehem means the house of bread. He was born in Bethlehem, the house of bread. The house of bread, if you know anything about astrology, is Virgo. And that's the virgin that gives birth to the child, the Christ. So, in Galilee, or the wheel of astrology, Jesus is going to be going around, and we've already discovered a few of those places. Bethsaida means the house of fish, or Pisces. And they went to Bethsaida. They started off in Capernaum, where his disciples were from. Capernaum means the house of sorrow, or disorder. It even came to mean hell by many people, Capernaum, at some point. But the etymology of the word is to be mourning, or to be in sorrow. And of course, in astrology, the house of sorrow is the 12th house. So Jesus then, this book begins to open up, and we begin to see the many facets. And how it's a spiritual treatise about your soul, about the Christ that is within you, that's going to heal the sick and redeem mankind. But we're also finding that it is literal, that Jesus literally got on ships. And Joseph of Arimathea then becomes, in the tradition, the knight that protects the Holy Grail. And when he goes to England, Glastonbury, England, this is the area called Somerset. This is where the Isles of Avalon, this is where the Isles of the Blessed are. Because Joseph of Arimathea takes his ships up there, and he starts the first church. This is in history. There isn't just one little sort of a myth that says this somewhere. There's lots of people that have written down this information and handed it down, and it's history that's been handed down through all the historians. We think of it just some kind of myth, but these are historians writing this information, telling us where Joseph of Arimathea went, taking Mary Magdalene and Martha and Sarah, their daughter, and their son, the royal prince, to Marseille, France. in the Rhine Valley of the Aquitaine and Burgundy in that area. This became the Valley of the Fisher Kings. And then at another time, Joseph of Arimathea, who's protecting this holy line of kings, they end up getting murdered and killed and pushed out. And they end up on the Isle of Avalon up in Glastonbury, where they had originally come when Jesus was still alive, and Jesus went with him, and they created the first church there. And this is recorded. Even the Catholics admit there was some, in the 14th century, there was some dispute about where was the first church, and the Romans were saying, we're the original church, and Rome admitted, because of the evidence of all of the history that they had available to them, they had people actually looking into it. And the Vatican Library will tell you that Glastonbury was the first Christian church. This is an established fact. Now, how did it get there? Well, the stories tell us, the history tells us that Joseph of Arimathea came there and built that original church. So, there's more to this. One day we'll get into where Joseph of Arimathea may have gone other than that, because even though Joseph of Arimathea wasn't the one promised to be the Messiah, which is Jesus, but each of these individuals did their part. James, the brother of the Lord, ended up dying in 62 A.D. He was faithfully, he was the leader of the Jerusalem community. And as we said, this was not just some small community. James was the whole complete leader of that whole entire region. When Jesus walked into Palestine, he established a Sanhedrin. In other words, a government. Nobody can establish 12 apostles and a Sanhedrin of 72. These are judges, as Moses did, to judge the children of Israel. So there's a whole lot more that's written in between the lines there in the New Testament that really, I mean, you could say it that way, but you could also it just understand that it's really not even written between the lines. It's just that, I mean, when it says that Jesus established the Sanhedrin, you would know that he was creating the government of God, establishing an actual kingdom. And you would know that nobody but a king could do that. All of the words that we read in the New Testament tell the story exactly and literally in many ways. There are lots of shadows and types in it, yes, but it tells you the story literally that Jesus came and established a Sanhedrin of 72. But because we don't translate it, today, most of us don't even realize there were 72 members on the Sanhedrin. And most of us have never heard that it was Ptolemy that convened a Sanhedrin, that there at that library at Alexandria put together the Holy Scriptures. So you see, they weren't making anything up. Pliny wrote his story. He wrote, he was a philosopher. They were scientists, just like Newton. Newton was a philosopher and a scientist, but he was also a spiritual person. They separated those two things. They didn't write fake documents, invent anything. They knew how important this information was, that it was the history of mankind. Ptolemy the 14th didn't want to be ruler, neither did Jesus. What they wanted is to establish the kingdom of God and to go forth and send forth the apostles. So that would mean then, and we're going to have to probably get into another video to explain all of this, but that would mean that the 12 apostles were not just some goofballs in some robes with sandals walking around a little area about 40 miles preaching the gospel, but these were kings. Just like when Daniel went into Babylon, and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego were governors of satraps. Well, when Jesus chose these 12, he chose 12 individuals to reign in the 12 districts of the world, the entire world. And so it says that each of the apostles were sent far, far away. One of the apostles was sent to India, and one was sent to Europe. And Philip is the one who was commissioned over England, over in that area. And there's records that show that Philip commissioned Joseph of Arimathea to go and start the church in Glastonbury, England. There's lots of documents that you can go and look up online to find all this information. So when Jesus established his kingdom, he really did it. All over the world, and all the royal bloodlines of the world go back to Jesus, just as they all went back to David before him. And this is a real historical book, but it's a Reader's Digest version. And the reason it's in the Reader's Digest version is because Rome, the Holy Roman Empire, they hunted down the Fisher Kings and destroyed them. And they had an inquisition, and they destroyed all the bloodline and ran them out. And then instituted Charlemagne as emperor instead, who was not of the line of the royal Merovingian line or the Fisher Kings from Mary Magdalene's son and daughter in the Languedoc in the southern France, along the Rhine River. So the Roman Catholic Church murdered millions of people, every man, woman, and child, to try and get the Holy Seed and the Holy Faith, and they burned the Holy Scriptures. And it was the Fisher Kings, Peter Waldo, who translated the Bible into the common language. And it was Luther, and it was Calvin, and it was these individuals like Huss. Huss went up into Austria and created the Hussites, because he was taught by the Waldensians. They were missionaries that went into all the world, and they created little enclaves, and they created one up in Scotland, and they created others in England. And so these bloodlines were in all the earth. They were still there. But what did they want to do? Rule the world? Yeah. And that's what our book called the Bible is trying to tell us. There's 144,000 who are going to reign as kings and priests over this earth. And it starts with the 12. And higher than the 12 is the 7, and higher than the 7 is the 3. And these the two witnesses that stand before the Lord of the whole earth, these are the most important individuals in this kingdom. And beneath them, there is a group of 12 that are going to rule the 12 tribes, because it's all broken up into this astrological wheel. There's 12, there's 7, because there's 7 days in a week, and there's 52 weeks in a year, and 5 and 2 is 7. And then there's 3 deacons in each of the 12 houses, which makes 3 times 12 is 36. And it goes around day and night. There's 24 elders around God's throne. 24 elders. And then beneath them is the 72 elders. This is what Moses did when he was at the base of Mount Sinai. He divided up the people to rule over the rest of them into 50s. 50 is a sacred number because There's 7 times 70, which is 49, and then the 50th would be the Jubilee. So 7 has to do with time. The 50th Jubilee has to do with time in the cycle. Because you count time with 7s. So our world then is established in the end from the past. The first 7 men, from Adam to Enoch, will be the highest, the 7 archangels. And the 12 that were there when Jesus came to the world and found them, those are the same individuals that had been incarnated. And those same individuals will be incarnated now in this age, because there's going to be the gathering, the final harvest of the world. And there's going to be 144,000 priest kings that are going to be living stones built up for God to inhabit by spirit. So does God play favoritisms? He's going to choose 144,000 and the rest of mankind, they don't get to rule? No, there are no rulers. All of you are brothers. See, there's only a family. And we have one Father, which is our Father in heaven. So the firstborn, he gets the inheritance. That's the arrangement of our Father. And he cannot rule without his wife. There's a lot of stuff that we haven't been told how this organization works. But you see, it's going to be our Father that's going to rule over us. Our father and our mother. And so the 12 apostles had 12 wives, just as they did in the Olympian gods. The 12 Olympian gods had 12 wives, because there's 12 hours a day and 12 hours a night. So there's actually 24 hours in a day. So the 12 really are just how we say, actually, the 12 divine families that rule the world. And as we said there in the book of Jasher, it explains how these original 144,000 individuals were all living on the earth there in the days of Enoch, when he was lifted up and translated right to heaven, and the 144,000 were translated with him. And so they hold a special place, and they will be the rulers. They will be the ones who shall reign. And the rest of the world who have not yet awoken, all of us will be grafted in to Israel. Because blindness has happened in part to Israel until the Gentiles be come in. And then all Israel shall be saved. Because the Gentiles are Israel. They're only lost. And that's why the book of Revelation says, I saw a great multitude which no man was able to number, of every nation and every tribe and every tongue and every people, the small and the great, the rich and the poor. And John was surprised by that, and he says, who are these, my Lord? So I thought it was just Israel. You already showed me about the 144,000. Who are these? This great multitude of all nations. He says, these are the ones who have come out of the great tribulation. And they are standing around my throne. Because around God's throne is the 24 elders. And around that is his 4 living creatures, which is the astrological 12 houses. And in each of these houses, or tribes, we all live. And so there are 12,000 in each of these tribes. And during that millennium, those who will be born onto this earth will be born into one of these families. There will be 12,000 of each of these families. You'll be born into one of these families. And you'll be the children of the fathers. And Elijah shall return to turn the hearts of the fathers back towards their sons, and the sons back toward their fathers. And this arrangement will redeem all mankind. So anyway, I'm going to leave it at that, and we'll explain more of this, because there's a lot more to understand. There's a lot more things we can get into, but we've just gave you plenty to chew on there. And until tomorrow, we'll Have a good day.